Alright guys, so in this video we'll be going over variables and lists. Variables and lists have a lot in common in that they allow us to store data, but they're also different in how they allow us to store this data and also what we can do to manipulate that data. So in this video we'll be focusing more on lists, but I will go over variables just to make sure we can see how they're similar and different. So in our first section, we're going to talk about variables, and we'll see three main ideas. We'll see variable declaration, we'll see variable assignment, and finally we'll see variable reassignment and what that looks like and what we can do with that. All right, so variable declaration is simply creating the variable or telling the computer to create this variable. So we're going to create a variable called my name, and it will store my name. So we're going to say my underscore name. And that first part, typing the name of the variable, is declaring the variable. Now, when we do assignment, we simply put the equal sign or the assignment operator, and we put the value there. So now we're going to say my name is equal to Brian Chambers. So the first part, typing the name of the variable, is declaration. And then we use the assignment operator or the equal sign to assign a value to that variable. So if we think of variables as buckets, declaration is simply putting a label on that bucket. So in our case, this bucket would be a random empty bucket, and we put the label my underscore name on it. And finally, the data we put inside that bucket is the string Brian Chambers. So let's make one more variable. Let's say this variable is called age. So I declared the variable by typing the name of the variable, age. And now I'll use the equal sign or the assignment operator. And finally, I'll assign a value by putting the value 24. So we have two variables, my name and age, and we use the assignment operator, the equal sign, to store different values in them. So right there we have declaration and assignment. So I'm going to delete the first variable, my name, so I can demonstrate the concept of reassignment. So when I print age in line 2, let's see what the output is. So in our console, we can see that the output is 24. But let's say later on in my program, my age changes. Let's say I'm now 25. When I print age in line 5, and I'll put some labels on these. So I'll put line 2. And I'll put line 5. So let's see what happens when I print this. So you can see the console, it says line 2, 24, and line 5, 25. So all that happens is that imagine we have our bucket, and initially we put the number 24 in it, and then we empty our bucket in line 4, we empty our bucket, and we put the number 25 in it. So variable reassignment is simply changing the value that was stored inside the variable. Okay, so in this section, we're going to be focusing on lists and three things related to lists in particular. So we'll see how to define lists, how to manipulate lists, so like how to change the data inside lists, how to access that data, and all the things that we can do with that data. And then finally, we'll see some list methods. And afterwards, I'll show you how to find additional resources for lists. All right, guys, so let's get started with lists. So the first thing we'll do is see how to define or create a list. Similar to variables and dictionaries, the first step in creating a list is simply typing the name for that list. So we're going to make a list containing a few odd numbers, so I'll call it odd. And then we need the assignment operator, so the equal sign. And next we need some square brackets, right? So I'm just going to put a few odd numbers in this. Right? And just like that, we have our first list. So this list contains a few odd integers. Now let's make another list. Let's call this one names. So same first three steps: name of the list, assignment operator, and the square brackets. All right, John, and I'll leave that one short. So far we have lists that only contain one data type. The odds only contain integers, names only contains strings, but we can actually have lists with mixed data types. 3.5, a float, true, a boolean, a string, and finally an integer. So lists can hold multiple pieces of data, and you can mix and match the data inside of a list. In fact, you can actually even store a list inside another list. So let's say I created a list called collection. Inside that list, I can have a few single things by themselves, but then I can have another list. So the first element in this list is 35. The second element is actually a list. So this entire thing is the second element. And then we'll have the third element, right? So now we've seen how to declare the list and how to put data inside the list. But now let's see how to access the individual elements inside the list. So let's try that first with our odds list. So the way we do this is with something called indexing. So indexing allows us to specify which element in the list we want to access. And indexing starts at 0. So the first element in any list, so in this case 1, is always index 0. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to print the first element inside odds. So you call the name of the list, open square brackets, and then you put the index. So the first element is always 0, so I say 0. And let's see what happens. Prints out 1. Let me print out the second element. Three. And then the third element, right? So the first element is always the 0 index, and then it goes up by 1 there. So 0, 1, 2, 3, right? Let's try that out on names. If I want to print John, I would start counting from Sean. So Sean would be 0, Pete would be 1, and John would be 2. So I'm going to put names 2. Right, and just like that I get John. Alright, and mix would be the same, but the one that might be interesting is collection. So let's delete everything else and see what we can do with collection. So if I want to print the first element inside collection, and let me be very clear about what I'm printing by putting some labels. I'm going to say collection 0. Okay. And then I'm going to print the second element. Okay. finally the last element. Okay. So the first element is 35 right here. The second element is this entire list. And then the last element is true. So let's see what we can do with that second element, because as it is right now, I'm printing the entire list that's inside our list. But what if I wanted to print high? What if I wanted to print what's inside this list? So if we look at the list that's inside, we notice that 45 is in the first element, 78 is the second element, 2.7 is the third element, and high is the fourth element. So let me print this high out. So I'm going to say fourth element in nested list. And let's see what I can do. So I can say collection. So that's this element right here. So that's the second element. So I put a 1. And then I put another set of brackets. And I go 0, 1, 2, 3. Let's see. Yep. So the first element in our main list is 35. The second element in our main list is another list. And the fourth element inside that list is high. And then finally, the third element inside our main list is true. So we've seen a few things here. We've seen one, how to create the list, how to access the list, and how to access information inside a nested list. And really, a nested list is just a list inside a list. So the last thing I want to point out before we move on is, if you notice, each element in our lists are separated by commas. So whenever you're making your list, don't forget to separate each element with a comma. Alright, so let's go back to a simpler list so I can show you how to make changes to the elements inside a list. So let's go back to odds. So let's say I wanted to replace 3. I want to change the element that's in this position. So the way I can do that is with indexing as well. So remember, the first element is always index 0. So 1 is index 0. But then every element afterwards starts at 1 and goes up. So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But I want to change this element. So I would say odds 1, and I'm going to change it to 11. Okay. So I'll print the list before the change. And I'll print that list after the change. All right, let's see. So before the change, our list is 13579, and after the change, it's 111579. So changing it is simply accessing the index and reassigning a value to that index. So it's a very similar thing to what we saw with variables, how we can assign a value initially and simply change that value. Something else to realize about lists is that They store data similar to how variables store data. The only difference is that a list can store multiple pieces of data at once. All right, so now we're going to move on to list methods. We'll see some methods that will allow us to manipulate the data inside lists. The methods we'll go over are append, sort, reverse, remove, and clear. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but we'll see them in action in a second. All right, guys, so now we're going to take a look at some list methods and see how they can allow us to manipulate lists. So the first list method we're going to take a look at is the append method. And the append method simply allows us to add an element to the end of our list. So in line 1, my list is simply 15379. But let's say I want to add the number 11 to this list. I can do that using the append method. Alright, so the first thing I do is type the name of my list and then use the period sign and then append, and inside parentheses the element that I want to add to the list. So let's see what this looks like. So before the change, you can see that the list is 15379, but after the change, it's the same thing, except we now have 11 added to the end. So the append method simply allows us to add elements to the end of our list. Okay, so for this next method, I made some changes to the list. Our list is now unsorted and in random order, so it's a perfect chance to show you the sort method. So the sort method does what the name says. It sorts the list from lowest to highest. Let's see. So when using the sort method and any method, never forget to have your parentheses. Even if nothing is inside the parentheses, you still need to have the parentheses. So if you notice, before the change, we have our regular unsorted list, but after sorting it, it's going from smallest to largest. All right, so this next method is called the reverse method. And it is another self-explanatory method. It takes the list and it reverses the order. So as you can see right here, our list, the only thing that has changed is it was basically inverted or reversed. Okay, so this next method, and it is the remove method. So the way it works is we simply put the name of our list, dot remove, and in parentheses, we put the element that we want to remove. So I want to remove the element 13 from my list. So I'll put dot remove 13, and when I hit run, our list changes. So it has, before the change, it has the element 13 at the end, but after the change, 13 is no longer in the list. Okay, and our final method takes the remove method and goes one step further, and this is the clear method. So the clear method removes everything from our list. Let's see what happens when I hit run. So before the clear method is called, you can see we have our regular list, but after it is a completely empty list. And that's it for our basic lists.